What's going on, fellas? I believe this is Hot and Cold Takes number 4, where you guys give me your controversial strength training, conditioning, strength sport related opinions, and I let you guys know whether I agree, disagree, whether it's a hot take, cold take, kind of break down why I think that, and hopefully we can have some good discussion. So as always, if you have a controversial take that you want me to weigh in on, you're going through your week, you see some shit on Instagram that everybody seems to agree on but you, think a little old Sam, and toss it in the community post that I will put up probably a day or two before I do the next one of these. So keep me in mind. But got a lot of them today, so we're going to get straight into it. The first one, concurrent periodization is better suited to recreational lifters. That's a really interesting take. I think that, honestly, I think that's a good take. That's a hot take. Hot take, good take. Because I've talked a couple times now about the fact that most variance in strength in the squat, bench, deadlift, the majority of it, even in higher level powerlifters, can be explained by hypertrophy, like muscle cross-sectional area of the primary movers. That explains a lot of the variance in weight performed. So if you're a beginner lifter, yes, there's technique, yes, there's neural efficiency, yes, there's yada, 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 but probably the biggest difference between you and someone much better than you is the some muscle mass. So that being said, a beginner lifter, if that's the number one thing standing between us and bigger lifts, obviously technique's important, yada, yada, yada. But if that's probably the number one thing standing between us and bigger lifts, it doesn't make sense to periodize our training in a way where hypertrophy isn't much of a focus at all for a third of our training in like a traditional hypertrophy strength peak rinse repeat style training cycle. I think that completely deprioritizing hypertrophy is probably a bad idea. So keeping some emphasis in, even through the strength and the peaking cycles, is a good idea. And definitionally, that is concurrent. So I agree with you. I think that there should still be that underlying general periodization structure, because I guess that's just my bias and what I've seen work most consistently for most people. But in that regard, I would keep it concurrent, as in we're never really stopping our efforts to grow. The next one, functional training doesn't exist. For the most part, I agree with you. It's an undefined term that people kind of use as a catch-all to sell the idea that they have some kind of novel training that you can't get for free elsewhere, right? It's just kind of a marketing term. It's kind of like how the word natural on food is not an FDA regulated term. It doesn't mean anything. Organic does have some constraints as to what it means. There are certain standards that have to be met to legally be able to call it organic, but natural, as far as I know, has no standards. I think functional is very much the same way, as we're just using this definitionless term to make ourselves seem unique. But that being said, I think that on some level, I understand what some people are trying to get at. If they're not just trying to sell you something, they're trying to get at the fact that, hey, this motion, you'll feel the strength you build on this motion is more applicable to feats of strength in your day-to-day life, aka some motions might have more transference to a wider variety of tasks than others, to which I might agree. I think that if we're doing something that's challenging our balance, loading our core, challenging, our proprioception through space, it's probably going to improve our performance on a wider variety of tasks in the outside world than other things. So kind of it can be a real thing. It's just more often than not used as a cheap term. But I don't think it's too crazy to say that, like, hey, something where we're moving our body through space for legs, like a walking lunge, a split squat, even a barbell squat, something like that, where we're moving our body through space, challenging our balance, challenging our coordination, that will probably have a more measurable increase to then when we go try to carry something heavy on the farm than doing the equivalent number of sets of leg extensions. So I guess in that way, maybe it exists, but I'll give you a certified hot take on that one. It's not a real thing. The next one, squatting with wraps, is raw, but it's more like a diet raw or raw light. Hot take. I think that a lot of the equipment use comes from an era when we we were under the impression that squatting was innately harmful to the knees. We also thought that squatting was innately harmful to the hips. And the suits weren't originally implemented with the rationale of increasing our lifts. It was supposed to make lifting safer because we thought that lifting weights was inherently deleterious to our body, which we found out wasn't true for the suits. We moved away from them because we found that they weren't needed for safe lifting. They were just inflating the numbers. And I think the same thing can largely be said about wraps, right? Some people have bad knees. Using a knee wrap allows them to train squat on a regular basis. I would try to address the underlying cause, but if you've given that a real college effort and you can't seem to get it sorted, you've gone to a physical therapist, can't seem to get it sorted, squatting in reps is a lot better than squatting constantly in pain in sleeves. So I think they can have their place. I mean, if you're in a competitive environment where you're allowed them, they can have their place. If you like them, they can have their place. But yeah, I do think that I'm glad that sleeves are completely surpassing wraps at this point. Even for high-level untested meets, there's more and more of them in sleeves. So the reason I didn't like those Inzer sleeves, which today, if you haven't heard the news, supposedly those fancy Inzer sleeves that are like $140 that everybody's been buying are not legal. They were approved by basically every major federation. People found that these sleeves were much stiffer than any other sleeve. They were getting way more weight out of these, and they were willing to pay the $140. Everybody and their mother goes and buys a pair to jack up their squat within the rules. Turns out that maybe these sleeves are not compliant within the rules and are possibly going to get banned. So people are out $140 because this company intentionally mismarketed them, the Inzer sleeves. So kind of interesting. Me and Max always didn't like that. Kind of rubs me the wrong way. The spirit of the sleeves divisions that we're moving away from wraps, so we're not trying to get that much weight out of our equipment other than our belt. It's kind of the spirit of Raw to me. But that being said, you can't stop people from trying to maximize what they can do within the competitive result. But I've never liked the idea of getting a tremendous amount of weight out of equipment, so I tend to not like wraps. But that's my bias. There's tons of great lifters love them. But again, I'll give you a hot take on that one. Sleeve gang for life. The next one, overhead press is cooler than bench. Whether this is a hot take depends on what's going well. Right now, my bench is going swimmingly. This is a freezing cold take. I think I replied to this like 4 days ago. I said this is a hot take. Well, bench is going better now. Freezing cold take. Terrible opinion. I think they're both cool. It just depends on what your goals are and whatnot. I tend to like them both. I think that those are kind of the two coolest pressing motions to me. So the next one. ATG squats are way better for strength, hypertrophy, and generally better for the long run. Sumo is not plus. Okay, so we got two here. Sumo is not cheating. Straps plus bumpers plus deadlift bar is the reason people think it is. And take 3, Zamani will get injured and won't do the world record bench in comp. Okay, so let's go through these. ATG squats definitionally are probably most certainly better for hypertrophy. We're taking the knee joint through a greater range of motion. We're going to hypertrophy the quads more on a set-to-set basis. Don't know if they're better for strength because a lot of people squatting as deep as they're able to with good mechanics. I don't think you would look at that and define that as ATG. A lot of my squats, I promise you, I'm going as low as I can, and obsessing about getting to some arbitrary level of astagrass, I think, is probably going to hold you back in terms of strength. But I do think that for the most part, for its strength, hypertrophy, or general long run, the rule of thumb is that we should be squatting as deep as we are able to with good mechanics. You're going to get to a point where like, hey, I could go lower, but I'm just going to allow my lower back to round under me, at which point it's probably not a great idea to do that just to chase some arbitrary standard of ATG. But I think that's a reasonable take. The next one is Sumo is not cheating. Straps plus bumpers plus deadlift bar is the reason people think it is. I think this is a good take. I think I've talked about in the past how based on a technically proficient Sumo, off the ground is going to be the most mechanically difficult part. So using a deadlift bar, using straps to lengthen your arms artificially, and using bumpers so that the deadlift bar will bend additionally is going to disproportionately benefit a Sumo deadlifter compared to a conventional deadlifter, because we are easing up and improving the start position of the most difficult part of the motion. So they're going to get way more out of like a circus gym lift. I do think, if we're going barehanded in barehanded on a stiff bar, especially, the difference between the two becomes a lot smaller. I do think that if we're going barehanded on a deadlift bar on kilos, sumo is often, like, if you're below 275, going to outperform conventional if we assume equal technical proficiency. But where people go wrong is they're like, well, it's not easier. It's really hard to get technically proficient at sumo. It's probably harder. It's a more technical lift. And that's the real nuance to the argument, is just saying, assuming technical proficiency is the same. So a really good sumo deadlifter is going to probably outlift a really good, similarly strong. So a really good sumo deadlifter is going to outlift a very similar strength, similar skill conventional deadlifter. But it is probably harder to reach that level of technical mastery on a sumo deadlift. So that's, I think, where the nuance comes in. I'm not going to lie to you guys. I really don't like throwing out things that I can't say definitively, but gosh golly, I am very dubious of Daniel Zamani's bench. I think there were a couple of competitions in Iran this year. If his rationale for not doing it in competition is that he doesn't want to put his body through that stress, it doesn't make any sense. If he went and did it in training anyway, you may as well have just done it in a local meet. That would lend it way more legitimacy than just a gym lift. I think that if he had done it in a local meet in Iran, given travel restrictions, I think that would be perfectly acceptable and understandable, as that was the best it could be done. In a perfect world, he does it on an international stage, head-to-head with Julius Maddox, but given travel restrictions, I understand why that can't happen. But I don't understand, especially with the reasonable amount of monetary backing, the size of his following, they could put together a contest for Zamani as they did for Thor's deadlift and just weigh the plates live on the live stream as they did for Thor's lift. And I think it would have lent it much more legitimacy. So if you're going to bother to put your body through that in training anyway, not going through the steps to make it legitimate is a little bit weird. The zoomed in picture that Death Grip Derek put on his story, where the kilos didn't appear to be exactly the same diameter, extremely suspect. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to tell you guys like definitively it's fake, because I don't think you nor I nor anybody but him really knows that. But I will say that it has set off my alarms a little bit. I am a little bit skeptical. The next one, weighted chin-ups, are an underrated strength exercise that people should treat as serious as the bench press or the overhead press. I guess that just depends on your goals. If your goals just as much is to have a good 1RM on the weighted pull-up as it is to have a good 1RM on the overhead press or the bench press, then that makes sense. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that that's probably going to, if you're training it maximally for a 1RM, it could interfere with your strength on the bench press and overhead press. So if those are more important, maybe dialing back the priority of the pull-ups. I don't know. I can't say, because I have not found that much success with them myself. At one point in time, I got reasonably strong at weighted neutral grip pull-ups. I think I was doing sets of 5 with like 2 plates or something. I don't know how good in the grand scheme of that is. I think I did like doubles or triples with 3 plates, so 135. And that was the strongest I ever was on those. And I know neutral grips are a little bit easier. And I didn't find that it carried over to a wide variety of motions. I just found that I was getting better at that motion. But I'm going to say that I've also seen, for guys I coach, weighted pull-ups carry over. Like for Max, they've done a great job building up probably both his bench and his deadlift, or at least helping. Not building it up directly, but helping. So I think it probably just depends on the individual. So I can't give this a hot or cold take. It just depends on the person. They might be for you. They might be quite a bit less useful as they are for me. The next one is bench press should not have a pause for powerlifting competition. It is impossible to have a consistent pause across different judges. Also, it just seems to be a random rule. Not sure the history behind it, but a touch and go bench press is still a solid indicator of strength as long as the bum stays on the bench. Squats aren't paused in competition. Okay, that's an interesting take. I can see where you're coming at this logically. I really get it, right? And if I walk through this on a purely logical level, like, okay, I definitely see where you're coming at. From a practical perspective, the first thing that jumps out at me is the people who are doing max width grip, huge arch bench presses would then have an even bigger advantage, because much like a sumo deadlift, when we're taking our application of force wider, whether we're widening the grip on the bench or widening our feet on the deadlift, what we're doing is we're making the bottommost position more challenging, which is why a deadlift bar makes sumo makes sumo deadlifts quite a bit easier, and it's why arching makes wide grip benching quite a bit easier, because in both cases we're removing some of the most difficult part of the motion with the strategy that we're using. And pausing at the lowest point in a wide grip bench press is making it quite a bit more difficult. If those people could touch and go, they would even have more of an advantage over people who are doing more of a traditional longer range of motion, smaller arch bench press. So practical application, I know a lot of people don't like those benches, so they'd be even more inflated. So that's one thing, just practically speaking. I think the other reason is that when we use a stretch reflex on a squat, we're not slamming the bar into ourselves. So I think that the problem is that people might really push the limits of that ballistic style bench to where there might be an injury risk associated with it if we're just trying to trampoline it off our chest as much as we can to maximize our competitive result. It might have a slight increase in injury risk, but most of all, it's going to look abhorrent. If people are really pushing the absolute limits of bouncing the shit out of it off their chest to the absolute hell and back, it's going to look terrible, and it will help to grow the sport. I think that's a little bit of the last rationale. Someone goes, someone brought up the point that they're pretty sure they added in the pause to eliminate bouncing, which I believe was the case as well. Although there's no need for long pauses. I think that's a good point. This is something that I'm bothered by pretty frequently. Basically, if we look at the rules of any major federation, there is no clarified duration for the pause. It just needs to have a pause effectively. You need to see that it comes down, comes to a stop under control, and then you immediately should be given the press command. Some federations, especially so I hear the Canadian IPF branch is notorious for having pretty long bench commands, that's cool, but it's also, why are you being held to a standard that isn't what's in the book for some arbitrary, like we lift to the hardest standard thing? I think it should be enforced as written. If you want it to be enforced to a harder standard, write it as a harder standard. Don't arbitrarily do it for the sake of, I don't know, like pride of the federation, when that's not what's written in the rule books. I do think that annoys me a little bit when, especially people will get held for a long time for no discernible reason, and there's no real reason that the ref doesn't need to justify it. I just don't like it. I think it's making things unnecessarily hard on the lifter where that's not what the rules say. All right, and then I've got a couple more detailed hot takes from my friend Lucas. He sent these to me because he wanted to hear my takes on them. And he is a good coach and a very good strongman. He would absolutely wax me at a strongman contest nowadays. So a little bit of extra credibility to these. So we'll read through them. I'll let you guys know what I think. I believe the increase in popularity of strength sports has been positive by and large. Increased access to proper training facilities, free access to information online has done wonders for our sport. That being said, I think it has created a generation of young lifters that's the blind leading the blind. These kids can tell you everything you need to know about PEDs, or at least what TikTok says, but couldn't design a single intelligent day of training. They need special racks, plates, gears, shoes, supplements, and perfect conditions to train, and a phone for their IG better vid. Oh, and they need to film the training basically for it to be worth doing. They have access to everything but gravitate towards nonsense. I'm going to tell you, Lucas, I think this is a medium boomer take. I think that there's always the average lower level lifter has always kind of sucked. It's kind of a pick your poison type deal. I think that, like you mentioned, there's kind of this weird paralysis by analysis and lack of trial and error, and just this endless speculation online about what's optimal and never kind of testing when the rubber meets the road. Because I have met a lot of people that are exactly how you said. They can read me a whole thing about programming, but then if they write a program, you could look at it, I could look at it, and you're like, wow, this is really incoherent. This is just kind of throwing a hodgepodge of things that you've read online. You don't really have you cognitively understand it. You could probably pass a written test on it, but you don't really have the first-person experience of practically what this might look like in a program. I've met a lot of people like that, and I think the only way to learn that is to just trial and error in your own training. I think that, for every lifter that is completely paralyzed, we also get someone who's a product of the modern era, product of good training environments. They're a smart guy, they're a hardworking guy, and you get these like phenom lifters like Luke Richardson back in the day. It was very much just hey, this is the same driven guy that would have been really good 10 years ago, but now he has access to great information and great training facilities, so now he's amazing. Right, so it's like there's people who fail to take advantage of it and people who take advantage of it. I definitely see what you mean. I know a lot of people like that. As far as the blind leading the blind, yes and no. I mean, the same thing happened back when it was just ask the big guy at your gym what he's doing. That's very much blind lead the blind. So I guess I don't know if I can say it's gotten worse. People do tend to gravitate towards nonsense because it sounds interesting, and saying correct answers sounds really boring. Like, hey, it's going to take you about 10 years. Hey, you just need to do the same thing over and over with minor tweaks here and there. Like, hey, you're looking to add 5 to 10 pounds per training cycle, not hit 50-pound PRs. These answers aren't sexy. They're not what people are going to look at. So I definitely see what you're saying there, but I don't necessarily think it's any better or worse. Like the people who aren't smart are going to do the same thing they used to, which is just listen to bad advice. The people who are smart are going to take advantage of the resources, but ultimately just trial and error to find what works for them. I'm going to say this is a medium take. I definitely see where you're coming at this from, but I don't think that it's any worse. I don't think the problem is a new issue. It's just the same issue with access to more information. The second one, appropriate intensity on accessories is one of the most overlooked elements of training. The most common example I see is in lifters that never see increases in the bench press. I already agree with you. This is a hot take. Even when benching with appropriate frequencies, intensities, and volumes, their top numbers flatline. The USAPL bros who would see a lot more progress if they threw their second SBD day sub 5 RPE nonsense and sent it on some tricep press downs every now and then. I think that you would generally agree with my speculation that of the 3 lifts, bench press is the most dependent on the hypertrophy of the primary movers in the triceps, shoulders, and pecs. That's going to be the biggest predictor, right? Technical efficiency is important, neural efficiency is important, but of the 3 lifts, that's the one where just getting bigger carries over the most directly. This is the reason that a shitty recreational bodybuilder will a lot of the time outbench a shitty recreational powerlifter, because they go bother to eat and train in a manner that's conducive to hypertrophy. Whereas, like you said, a lot of people who really have plateaued benches aren't doing that for themselves. They're not prioritizing developing muscle mass with time in the primary movers. Hot take, lots of people want to train the way the guys they look up to trained, when the guys they look up to are either so hypertrophically blessed genetically that they never needed to do it and they were able to grow from their submaximal SBD days, or they started it with a different style of training that involved more emphasis on hypertrophy and then specialized as they needed to derive progress when they became more advanced and had a hypertrophy base. So hot take, approved. Number 3, young lifters pursuing weight class specific goals is holding back their progress. They're so determined to stay small as they can for insignificant records and titles that they are hindering their progression. Like quotation, if I can just add 200 pounds to my total and water cut 15 pounds, I can break the 64 kg Team 2 bench only state record while doing the Sagittarius moon rising. Dude, just eat and train hard for a long period of time. Sometimes in the pursuit of strength, you may be required to put on a pound or 2 of muscle. I doubt the size you were at 16 is the size you need to be your peak physical strength. Absolutely agree. I think a lot of people have a hard time envisioning how much their body can change across 10 years. They can't see themselves adding 15 pounds of lean muscle over the course of 5 years, right? Which is something that most natural lifters getting to lifting can absolutely achieve. They can't imagine that. So the only way, and they can't imagine that the amount of strength that will come with that. So the only way they can imagine them. All right, I'm not exactly sure where that cut me off as my camera died, but I believe what I was saying is that because people can't foresee themselves, they can't imagine themselves getting substantially stronger by putting on muscle mass, so they can't imagine themselves becoming a bigger person. The only way they can imagine being competitive is in the weight class they're in currently or the one below it, and constantly chasing that leads to them not progressing in the manner that they probably should. If we are looking to be the best, especially powerlifter we could look to, say, IPF World, USAPL Nationals, and say, okay, in my weight class, if I look at the podium, are they all substantially shorter than me? Probably yes. That means to be the best competitor that you can be, you're probably going to have to work your way up weight classes with time. It's not wise to just bloat max your way up immediately to that weight class where you would be the right height, because we already know that's not the best way to gain muscle. But through your training, you should allow your body to grow and allow your BMI to raise up to the weight class where the people are roughly your height. That's a good general rule of thumb. There are like height to weight ratios that like Boroshaiko has posed, or charts that Boroshaiko has posed about like based on your height, what's your optimal weight class that you should work your way up to eventually. But regardless, I think you probably, like Lucas said in his take, the weight you were when you were 16 is probably not the weight. It doesn't happen to be the weight that you would be your optimal weight class as a strength athlete unless you were significantly overweight at the age of 16. If you look at like how Ed Cohn did his career, he did as much as he could in a weight class, and as he began to outgrow it, he moved up one. And there was a period where he's less competitive. And I think that's the other thing, is this fear of not being competitive. Once you reach some level of, oh, I'm competitive on a statewide level, I'm competitive on a Team 3 national level, this overwhelming fear of temporarily not being relevant, when that might be better for your long-term development. Maybe when you go up a weight class, you're not the best in your new weight class where you used to be. Like, let's say you go from 165 to 181. You're not a great 181 for a while, but then your upper end limit might be better, right? People say, oh, well, what about John Hack? He's like 5'10 and was a great 181. I'm 5'10. Well, first of all, you're not John Hack, and John Hack at 198 was even better than John Hack at 181 was. And then John Hack with a pretty substantial weight cut to 198 is an even better lifter, Wilks-wise, than he was at 198. So even in his case, when you're an extreme genetic anomaly and you're able to be the best in a weight class that might not be optimal, he's then gotten even better by moving into more appropriate weight classes based on his height. So hot take. This next one, I feel like you're coming for me with this one, Lucas. The next one is the way most heavyweight strongmen train for the overhead press is a fundamental misunderstanding of how to achieve big numbers in overhead events. They spend every ounce of energy trying to build a world-class strict press when they have mediocre positions and leg drive, as far as like mechanics and power of the leg drive. Relying on strict pressing power as the key driving factor for overhead events only allows for the most insanely genetically gifted to do quote-unquote well in these events. I would argue that training more like an Olympic weightlifter, moving big weights using bigger musculature would allow nearly all strongmen to improve their overhead events. So I tend to agree. I think this is a hot take. If we break this down and we look at the highest level of performance across women's weight classes, for the most part, right, a more technically proficient overhead utilizing the legs is it's what's breaking the world records. In the lighter weight classes for men, right, this is what's breaking the records. And the exemption to the rule is the heavyweights. And it's not necessarily that they're playing a totally different game. It's that, like you said, they're so big and freaky on so much gear and so goddamn strong that they can get away with not being the most technically efficient. If you're an up-and-coming strongman and you want to optimize your form across events, watching open class world's strongest man competitors oftentimes isn't the best place to learn from, because they haven't been forced to truly optimize every last thing. Watching lighter weight class competitors, watching top level women's competitors often is the best way. So if we gotta break this down, I'm gonna set Viking press aside. I'm just gonna, because I think it's a little bit different, and I'm lazy and I don't want to address Viking press. Circus dumbbell, 100% you're right. If you're trying to press a circus dumbbell, you're not trying to do it as a lower body event, you're probably going to be bad at the circus dumbbell. So 100% agree. If you're focusing on strict strength past just having like adequate stability in the shoulder to really stabilize those positions and be safe, definitely a misallocation if the bulk of your training is strict for a circus dumbbell. The axle, assuming you can front rack, the bulk of your training should be training just like an Olympic lifter, right? Because the axle is an implement that you can directly one-to-one apply a split jerk to, a push jerk to, an efficient push press to, and for everyone, for the most part, this is going to be the way to go. Even though the heaviest axle presses ever done by Eddie Hall and Bibby were both done strict. I think that's just because the record is underdeveloped, as there hasn't been much monetary backing or much accolades to come with breaking that specific record when compared to something like the log. So I think that if there was a huge monetary backing, it's just like first one to break the axle world record gets $100,000. I think that it would be pretty quickly moved over to a split jerk or push jerk technique that's a little bit more technical. And if you look at a local level, the guy with the biggest strict press is not the guy winning the axle. It's the guy who actually knows how to push press it, i.e. why Lucas, the guy who put this, would absolutely destroy me in an axle for max, right? I think the one where we can maybe get into some technicalities is something more cumbersome, like the log. That greater diameter probably increases the underlying demand for strict strength. I mean, if you look at someone who got reasonably proficient with their leg drive reasonably early, their positions reasonably early. Luke Richardson, when he switched over from powerlifting to strongman, pretty quickly got to 180 kilo log with a pretty good leg drive, but it wasn't until he also built up his underlying strict strength that he was able to sustainably progress that. So I think for the log press in particular, because we're having to force the bar or the log to travel backwards a little bit more, the demands are a little bit greater. Maybe especially at the bigger upper end maximal weights, there's an argument to be made that strict strength comes into play more if we look at the majority of the best, or not the best, the heaviest log pressers of all time in the open class. There is a pretty much universal underlying shoulder strength there, and I don't think in this case that's the record being underdeveloped. I do think most guys could benefit from being more proficient, right? Like Luke Stoltman has been doing phenomenal for himself, being one of the only guys with a good push press on the log, but there's also a tremendous amount of underlying strict shoulder strength there, and I think the demands of strict shoulder strength are going to be greater for the log, to where I think you could argue for a higher training priority, not higher than knowing how to actually use leg drive, but significantly higher than the other two overhead events we mentioned. I think that there's like a whole strict press is badass. When we look at that from a competitive standpoint in strongman, for the most part, that's really stupid. Those same people are going to show up to a contest to be like, well, yeah, I have strict press 315, and they're just going to lose to someone who strict press less than that, but actually knows how to utilize their legs in the event. And there's no real honor in losing your local strongman contest because you didn't bend your knees to do your press. So I tend to think that's a hot take, as much as I love strict pressing. And then number 5, touch and go reps in overhead press and deadlift in the context of strongman isn't an intelligent way to prepare for competition or for maxes. I think strongmen should do all of their deadlifting from dead stop and all of their overhead press from a pause in the rack. That's how reps need to happen in show day and max day. The start is often the most challenging portion of the lift, so it should be tested nearly in all of our rep work. Okay, yeah, I agree with this one. I think this is a hot take, right? I think that both touch and go overhead press and touch and go deadlift can have a place away from competition in more of a general preparatory phase, as they lend themselves to a little bit more volume. So maybe in a hypertrophy focused phase before we have a show picked and we're just trying to build general qualities, these things can have a place. But if we are prepping for an overhead event, or we are prepping for a deadlift event, because that's how they're going to be done in competition, the second we have that show picked, we should probably be doing our reps with a pause at the bottom, or with a dead stop on the deadlift. I think some people can get away with touch and go deadlifts for a lot of a prep. I think that they are the exception, though, and telling people that they should focus on doing dead stop reps, as the first rep is always going to be a dead stop. So if we're training for a max, we really should be doing dead stop reps. And in competition, more often than not, we're not allowed to touch and go, so it's more specific. I think some people can benefit from the controlled negative, but if we're aiming for the controlled negative, we can still then let it sink into the ground and do the rep dead stop, right? So it's like, if that's the argument to be made, I still think that dead stop's the way to go for deadlifts. Maybe in general preparatory phases, when we're looking at high reps, it's just impractical to do every single one dead stop, as the set ends up taking quite a while. So maybe I'll let an athlete get away with it if we're not preparing for anything in particular quite yet. But generally speaking, 100% agree. And then I also have found that, especially if we are preparing for a 1 rep max, doing all the overhead presses with a pause at the bottom, as you said, that's how the first rep is done more often than not. And biomechanically speaking, that bottommost position is the most difficult position. So we should be forcing ourselves to overcome that initial press rather than relying on a stretch reflex. I've found that I can crush a new 5RM with a touch and go, and that doesn't necessarily hold any bearings for my 1RM because, as you said, I'm basically only doing the hardest portion of the lift once. So I think even in an off season, you should probably be pausing your overhead presses as it's just more relevant. I think maybe the touch and go deadlifts you can get away with, but let me know what you guys think. I like Lucas's takes. I think they were all hot takes except for him being a boomer, which to his credit, he acknowledged when he sent these to me. He says he wants to start a series called Lucas's Front Porch, where he basically just complains about kids needing to get off his lawn, which I can understand that. I feel like once you've been around for a long time, you see the same people making the same mistakes over and over and over. You get a little bit crotchety about it, so I 100% understand that. So gonna throw this video together, throw it up while it's uploading. I will make a super cool thumbnail. As always, thank you guys for watching my videos. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like. It helps to grow the channel. Working towards that 1,000 subs, baby. And then also I have to get a bunch more watch hours before I can actually monetize the channel, but we're chugging along. Thank you guys for watching. Appreciate y'all.